have very different viewpoints on many things.
But a lot of these issues are American issues. They're not Republican or Democrat issues.
Joining us today is Professor Sergey Radchenko, the distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a leading expert in Cold War history. He's the author of To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power, which offers never-before-seen insights into Soviet foreign policy because there was a trove of newly uncovered archives just recently unsealed by the Kremlin. So, Professor Radchenko, we're thrilled to have you here. Thanks for joining. Could you start by just telling us a bit more about your background and what really inspired you to write this book?
Well, thank you, guys. Thank you for having me on. On my background, I was born on the border between Russia and China, or the Soviet Union and China, a little village, right, literally just a few kilometers from the border with China. And then when I was a kid of maybe, I guess I was just a few months old, my parents moved to Sakhalin Island. And so that's where I grew up, on Sakhalin Island, which is pretty far out there. I guess the part of Russia that Sarah Palin sees that from the backyard. But
Right.
very very remote, with great nature, but little else. And then when I was about 15 years old, this was already, the Cold War is ending. I had an opportunity to go to the United States as an exchange student. So I went to Texas, spent a few years in Texas, and then just kind of bounced around the world. Lived in China for a few years, in the UK as well, and Mongolia for about 3 years. And then eventually I ended up at SAIS, at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins, although I'm based at SAIS's center in Italy, in Bologna. So that's as far as my background goes, but you can see here there's a connection to the Cold War, I sort of have roots there, and that always attracted me as a subject of study. And so I have been writing about the Cold War for a number of years. I worked on nuclear history. I worked on Sino-Soviet relations, and that's particular, with reference to what I told you earlier. Me growing up in the Russian Far East, I always sort of had an interest in that part of the world. And then finally, I decided to do this massive book on the entire Cold War, starting from about 1943-44, and it continues even to the present. And that's actually one of the arguments of the book. I can talk more about it later. The dividing line between the Cold War and the post-Cold War is not as distinct for me in this book as it is for many other authors. So anyway, so I've decided to write this book. Took 10 years to write, and as a result, we have quite a tome. Yeah, it was. I really benefited from the new archive. That's a massive book, and I always, I feel bad for my readers sometimes, so they have to kind of go through this. But I just felt so excited about the material that I had access to, that I had to tell those stories, and they just barely scratched the surface, because they're all the stories, untold stories, the stories we thought we knew all about. Actually, we don't know enough about, that I wanted to tell on the basis of this new records that opened up. And of course, I wrote to my publisher. I said, well, how about we do 3-volume publication? Sort of like Kotkin with his 3-volume biography of Stalin of Yen Kershaw. And of course, the publisher just laughed.
Right.
No, you got to put it in 1 volume. So in the end, we do have this massive volume, but I hope readers will go through it and enjoy it, and find out new things about the Cold War.
By all means, when I was reading through it, it was wonderfully set up in the fact that it is comprehensive and you get to go through each leader and each decade, and you go through it at your own pace. But it was pretty comprehensive. So you mentioned the new archives that were unsealed. I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that process of maybe why Russia decided to do that, if you're aware of that, and then what that looked like. Were you staying in Russia? Were you traveling to like the Kremlin basement every day? Tell us a little bit more about the logistics of that.
So, I mean, it is a fascinating story, and historians love to talk about archives. And when you are talking about something like Russia in particular, the story becomes even more interesting. So, to give you broader background, which I don't really talk about in my book, but I think readers will want to know about this. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a period of I would call it chaotic opening of the archives. So things were just sort of dumped in hallways, and the enterprises and historians could go there and find stuff, sometimes randomly, that informed some of the earlier works on the Cold War written in the sort of in mid-1990s. And then things really started to shut down. It happened under Yeltsin, not under Putin, but things started to shut down around 93, 94. And suddenly historians traveling to Moscow, including me, because I started working there as a historian in the, well, I think from 2000 or so, researching at that time Sino-Soviet relations. I mean, I could find almost nothing. There would be just a trickle of documents, and you'd just look for any pieces of relevant information. And I was, I was desperate. And a lot of other historians working in the Cold War at that time just were giving up on Russia altogether and were going to other parts of the world. That is how I ended up in Mongolia, and that was the first, or certainly one of the first, if not the first, foreign researcher who did a lot of work in the Mongolian archives back in the day. I went to places as random as Laos and Burma looking for documents, also to Eastern Europe, to places like Hungary, in all across the former what you would call socialist camp, looking for scraps of evidence that would reflect on Soviet foreign policy through the lens, through the documents of those former allies. And so I did this, and I cannot complain about it. Hey, this was a great thing to do. Go around the world looking for documents. You feel like you're some kind of an investigator, a very underpaid one, unfortunately, but still, you would get this great, you'd get some great pieces of evidence. So I did that for a while. And then suddenly in the early 2010s, you had this remarkable turnaround in Moscow where a huge amount of material suddenly became available to historians. And because, this also coincides with with Putin's regime becoming more repressive, so a lot of people were just surprised, when I told them about this, saying, how do you even square the two? You've got on the one hand a deeply repressive regime that is becoming more and more authoritarian by the day. On the other hand, you have this materials that are just opening up. And so, we can discuss various theories why this happened. You might say one possibility is that Putin is simply obsessed with history. And I mean, if you actually follow what Putin does, and I do that on a daily basis, despite being a historian, I'm also quite interested in Russian contemporary affairs, but you sort of see what he does. And there was literally a meeting one time where he brought archival documents into the meeting. He said, look, we have history. Look, all of this stuff. Read this, So Putin does this kind of stuff. And so he was clearly interested, obsessed. Interested is not even the right word. Obsessed with history, seeing himself as some kind of new incarnation of Peter the Great or Ivan the Terrible or something like that. So that's one possibility, is that he kind of, he felt that getting those materials out would be beneficial. But I personally don't subscribe to this. I think the more reasonable version is simply that there was now money in the system to declassify documents. The Russian state became a little, the government had more money in around that time, and some of those projects, like, for example, the archives, could be better financed than previously. Because in order to declassify materials, you'd have to send some people there to read the documents and hopefully pronounce them declassified. And to do that, you'd have to pay them money to do that, But so anyway, so that's another possibility. I don't know. What I do know is that suddenly they've opened up all this material that was previously closed. But the funny thing is that nobody would go there and look at them. I mean, this is the interesting thing. I would be one of the few people in the archives. There was also Mark Kramer from Harvard. Mark was always there in the archives, and that was always there. So we were the two, heroes of this archival endeavor. I mean, some other people that I knew from my professional life also occasionally turned up, but basically I spent months sitting there. And you can imagine my excitement, because they're suddenly opening up these materials, like, for example, Khrushchev's personal files. And you go through, or Brezhnev's personal file, Khrushchev, Brezhnev being the Soviet leaders, and you go through this stuff. And when they bring you the materials, there's a little access sheet where people write their name when they first get the material. And I saw that I was the first person looking at all of this stuff,
Oh, wow.
every day. I was thinking, oh my God, what am I going to find there? What am I going to find? There's new stuff. You literally could just find anything. And I did find a lot of stuff, which obviously ended up being included in the book, and also a lot more that I unfortunately excluded. I mean, fortunately, I also managed to copy a lot of this material, which I now hold and I might use in future studies, because the sad reality is that despite the spirit of openness today, if anybody wanted to follow my example and go to Moscow, well, I don't recommend it, right? Because the Russian government is known for taking people hostage for no reason. So basically, for most intents and purposes, these archives are now off limits, which is very sad. And I was both the first and the last there, but I was very fortunate to be able to get these really hundreds of thousands of pages. Because also another thing that was a great breakthrough. Previously, they would not allow you to photocopy stuff or to use a camera, and suddenly they allowed to do that. There was actually a court decision that allowed you to take photos in the archives. I mean, in Russia, that's where you think, Russian courts, they're not good for anything. It's just completely a ridiculous system. But in this particular case, they let you, there was a court decision that allowed people to take pictures in the archives. So I did. And as a result, I have this, a massive amount of digital copies on Soviet foreign policy, of which I just used a small amount for the book because I simply could not cover every story.
Well, thank you for bringing it to us, because as from our last episode, we hosted Patrick O'Donnell here, and we love getting to these untold stories. And that's, thank you for giving us the exclusive here through your book, which is really fascinating, because and the next question I want to get to is, what are some preconceptions you might have had before going in? Because for someone like me, right, we didn't have access to the writings that you put in your wonderful book, and it's actually a great resource. I'd consider it a mini textbook. I caught the Oliver Stone documentary, and that had painted a more favorable light of Stalin, and had the U.S. just tried to work in more of a cooperative environment with him, things could have gone differently. And it didn't inform my whole opinion, but it certainly shaped it quite a bit. But now with this archive of documents you've had access to, I imagine there's a lot of things that have been shaken up in what we thought we knew about what the Soviet leaders, past and present, were thinking.
Right. The book obviously has a general thesis that I advance about the key principles of Soviet foreign policy, which some people will find difficult to stomach, and some people have already accused me of downplaying ideology and instead focusing on other things. So what is it that I focus on? Well, my big argument is that the Soviets valued nothing as much as they valued external recognition of their greatness. They wanted to be recognized as a great power, not just that, but also great revolutionary power. They wanted to be recognized by the United States. They wanted the Americans to accept the Soviets as an equal superpower. But they also wanted their clients in the socialist camp to accept the Soviet Union as the leader of the world revolutionary movement. And that's very important, because this is a very different type of recognition. So on the one hand, you want to be accepted as a great power by the United States. On the other hand, you've got, you want to be accepted as the leader of world communism. The people who could recognize you also differed. So the United States was the key for accepting, for giving the Soviets the legitimacy, the recognition as a great power, whereas the Chinese were key for the Soviets in recognizing them as the leaders of the world communist movement. And when the Chinese failed to do that, when they sort of withdrew that recognition, which happened in the late 1950s, you have this massive world that happens between Moscow and Beijing that continues for years and really defines Soviet foreign policy in so many ways that we did not previously appreciate. From the way that the Soviets thought about themselves internationally to particular crises, their behavior in places like Cuba or Berlin, all of that. In doing all of that, they reflected back on how, what the Chinese would think about them, how the Chinese would react. So that is a kind of a broad thesis. Another thesis that I underlined in the book about Soviet foreign policy behavior is I argued that because of that emphasis on recognition, this desire for legitimation as a great power, or desire for external legitimation, there's a lot of continuity to Soviet foreign policy. And indeed, I trace it from the late 1940s, from mid-1940s, from the beginning of the Cold War, all the way to the end of the Cold War. And even the end of the Cold War itself, and I alluded to that already, for me, doesn't mean quite as much as it has meant for many other historians who have worked on the Cold War. I'll explain why as well. This is where, your position as a historian also plays a role, because a lot of the histories of the Cold War that have been written already were written by people who were writing in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. And I think they were affected a bit by this kind of sense of the end of history, of euphoria. I don't want to dumb down the argument about the end of history, because actually I think Fukuyama's argument is much deeper than a lot of people are willing to appreciate. But anyway, there is this sense in the 1990s that that communism failed, and you reflect on the Cold War, something that happened in the past and is never going to repeat itself again. Now, this is the time when I'm still kind of grown up, really. I'm still going through my period of becoming a mature individual. And then when I become a historian, which is in the late 90s, early 2000s, the situation already starts to change. And it changes in Russia's relations with the West, with Putin's Munich speech in 2007, and increasingly deterioration of relations between Russia and the United States, but also the emergence of China as a factor. And increasingly people are looking back on the Cold War and thinking, and that was a very interesting period, but why is it that so many things that happened during the Cold War, why do they seem to be repeating themselves at present? Why is there such a similarity? I mean, if the Cold War ended, why is it that so many things are the same? So I kind of reflected on that in the book. And another big argument that I have there is that there were greater continuities that we were willing to appreciate between the Soviet and the post-Soviet experience. And that takes us not from the Cold War all the way to the present. I kind of trace that line and compare some factors. And the key factor, of course, is the Kremlin's desire for recognition. They wanted to be recognized as great back in the Soviet times, from Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev to Gorbachev. And they also retained that ambition, that drive, for recognition. They really wanted to have that, and they still want to have that even under Putin. And also in the book, and that's I guess, the third major theme of the book, I talk about China and how China was important, not just as a factor, defining Soviet foreign policy for much of the Cold War, but also how the Chinese themselves thought about the Cold War. So I guess about a third of the book is really about China and not so much about the USSR's. It is about Chinese foreign policy. And what do I find there? I find that the Chinese were driven by the same desire for recognition, desire for greatness like the Soviet. So there's a pattern here. There's a pattern here.
It almost felt like that infighting that was going on. I think in the book you said something about how the USSR felt as though they went from playing first fiddle in that relationship to playing second fiddle. And it almost felt that that was the fight that they were vying with the West for the entire time, and almost just added to that aggravation. So understandably so. It was interesting you say the critics came at you about not enough focus on ideology. And in my opinion, knowing not much about the Cold War, that's basically our only understanding. And we kind of write off all of these actions by these leaders as, oh, well, we chalk it up to Marxist-Leninism. That's how it works. But you were able to give us, based on this archival documentation and these personal records, this kind of psychological insight. And it's so important, right, to understand how they're acting.
I mean, that's right. And there are two aspects to this. First, let's talk about the psychology of leadership. When you have this massive amount of new materials that I talked about, Brezhnev's personal files, Khrushchev's personal files, Stalin's personal files, Gorbachev's personal files, you have them, you sort of observe them on a day-to-day basis, right? They talk They have meetings of the Politburo. They make speeches. They have meetings with foreign leaders where you have those back and forth, and they repeat themselves all the time. So after a while, after you've read sort of 100,000 pages of this stuff, you realize that actually they you realize who they were really. They realize how they operated, what they thought about the world. So you get you draw a conclusion about them, not so much as leaders, but as individuals. And it's almost personal. I mean, I felt like a psychiatrist, and I'm not a trained psychiatrist, by the way, right? But I felt like I needed a training of a psychiatrist to be there in the room with these people, because they repeat the same things, and you kind of start to diagnose some of their issues. You think, okay, you've talked about this before. What does that mean? What is it? Why do you keep talking about this? So I thought that psychological approach was very beneficial for me in the book, because once you get to know them very closely like that, you kind of see them for complex individuals and not just robots, or you don't see them for these figures from propaganda that just speak from the script of Marxist-Leninist literature. Speaking of which, Soviet leaders, with the exception of Stalin and a partial exception of Gorbachev, didn't know that much about Marxism, Leninism. I mean, do you think that Nikita Khrushchev was a keen reader of Das Kapital? I assure you not. He probably never touched it. He may have read the Communist Manifesto, maybe, hopefully. Brezhnev, these people did not read. These people did not read. So what is it that actually formed their worldview? And that is where it becomes important, because worldview is not the same as ideology, but they're kind of compatible things, right? So worldview seems to me, at least to me, it seems like something broader than ideology, because ideology refers to something specific. When we talk about Marxism, Leninism, we talk about a particular, body of work, particular principles about that highlights how the world works. Well, what does Marxism, Leninism have to say about racism, for example? I assure you, not a lot. Not a lot in terms of prescriptions. And yet you have this, if you analyze, for example, Brezhnev's actions and his view of China, there's so much racism there. And you think, where did he pick it up? Did he go to Marx to find? I mean, Marx also had some, by the way, had deeply problematic views of the Orient, right, or as he called it. But that's not where Brezhnev went. No, he internalized certain values, certain ideas, certain stereotypes from the culture that he grew up with. He had a particular view of China, and it was less, I think, impacted by Marxism, Leninism, and more by this, this kind of basically conventional traditional Russian racism almost towards Asia. You could see that. You could see how it played out in policy. So is that ideology or is it worldview? Of course, it's a worldview. Is it ideology? Well, you could call it kind of ideology, but it's not Marxism, Leninism. So that's where it becomes very complicated. And you say, well, the Cold War was about the struggle between capitalism and communism. And I will say to you, well, it's so much more than this, right? So much more. There are all these cultural issues. There are all this, traditions like Russian imperialist tradition that influences Soviet foreign policy making throughout the Cold War. Other things that just do not have roots in Marxism, Leninism. And I think if we adopt this broader understanding, it makes it easier to see why the Cold War unfolded, how it ended, and why so many parts of the Cold War, some aspects of it, survived to the present day.
See, I think the psychological analysis was really important because it just highlights and adds more complexity to the fabric of the story than just simply talking about ideologies. And just for instance, how many U.S. presidents, maybe only 4 to 8 years at a time served, and then you look that there's really only 4 or 5 leaders throughout this, large stretch of history. So it was not only just internally dealing with their own personalities within the party, within the Soviet Union, but then it was also their challenge in dealing with the different personalities of each of the presidents that they tried to, the U.S. presidents that they tried to work with over time. And there's a quote that I think really encapsulates the feelings of insecurity or the psychological motivations of the Russians is, am I a trembling creature or do I have the right? You know, that was not a quote that you would, or a phrase you would say from a place of strength, right? That's a place of insecurity. And I think that really encapsulated it. And then more so to that is the struggle between China and the USSR to try to be the leader of the socialist camp. That's a conflict that I wasn't aware of. I knew there was a divide between the relations, but that's my next book now is I want to dive into just the Sino-Soviet relations because there is a whole extra Cold War, if you will, going on there.
Well, that's right. In fact, Lawrence Luthi, who's a good friend of mine at University of McGill, wrote a book, The Sino-Soviet Split, with a subtitle, A Cold War in the Communist World, something like that. It's a great book, by the way, where he really emphasizes the importance of ideology, something I've disagreed with him for the last 20 years. But going back to this question of am I a trembling creature or do I have the right? I never saw Khrushchev say that, right? But it's sort of my interpretation of his actions. And for those listeners or viewers who don't know what this is about, this comes from Dostoevsky's book Crime and Punishment, where there's this guy called Raskolnikov who goes there and kills an old lady, pawnbroker lady, and her sister. The pawnbroker lady on purpose, the sister by accident. She just happened to be there. And then it happens right at the beginning of the book, right? And then for the rest of the book, which is a great book, he he has this mental anguish and he's trying to figure out why he did it, etc. And then at one point he has this kind of a monologue in which he spells out his reasons. And the ostensible reason for killing the old lady was that he would get some money and then he would build his career and then become a great person. And so he makes a reference to Napoleon. Well, if Napoleon at the start of his career, he had to kill an old lady, would he not do that? Of course he would do that. So no problem there. But then as he goes through, it's almost as if money doesn't matter to Raskolnikov. It was more about asserting his right to disregard existing morals, existing norms of the society that he lived in. And that's where he says, am I a trembling creature or do I have the right? The right to do what? The right to do whatever, to do whatever, to be the Superman, as Nietzsche would put it in Das Spake Zarathustra. Exactly that kind, this kind of concepts of challenging the existing hierarchies. And what I argue in the book is that you can see with the Soviets that's exactly what they wanted to do. I mean, these are people who are at the start of the communist revolution. These are intellectuals who come to power. They hold on to power. Very unlikely outcome, but they are able to hold on to power. They're not recognized by the world. Then comes the Second World War. And at the end of the Second World War, the Soviets emerged not only as a powerful actor, but really as the most powerful actor in Europe. And they feel like they're due something. They feel like they have the right to set the new norms, to do whatever they want, really, without being told by others, i.e. the West, how to behave and what to do. And they keep doing that throughout the Cold War. And they feel that it's combined with that sense of inferiority. We have the right. We're not trembling creatures. We have the right because, well, by the way, we have nuclear weapons,
Right,
so,
right.
etc. But every time they do something, like, for example, Khrushchev sending missiles to Cuba, on the one hand, he's asserting his right. I have the right because the Americans are doing the same thing in Turkey or in Italy. But actually, he's kind of doubtful still. Does he really have the right? Obviously, he pulls out on the end from Cuba, showing that he doesn't quite have the right to do what he thought he had the right to do. So there is this interesting interplay with Dostoevsky. And of course, there's that statement, am I a trembling creature or do I have the right? It also comes back in the form of Putin's challenge to the West, which is where I see kind of a continuity that goes from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, because Putin is also emerging and saying, well, we're a nuclear power, we can do whatever we want. Try to tell us not to. And then, that brings us to where we are, sadly and tragically.
So, in your personal opinion, I'm glad that you brought this back to modern times and Putin. I'm curious if you see, after going through all of these processes and so in depth studying these leaders and their psychology, do you believe that Putin sees himself on par with one of these great Soviet leaders like Stalin figure? Do you think he sees himself that way, and that might be inspiring some of his more aggressive moves lately?
So that's a super interesting question. Of course, we have Putin talking about, I've mentioned about his obsession with history. He's
Right.
compared himself with Peter the Great. We know that he likes Peter the Great, which is kind of ironic because Peter the Great was the great westernizer of Russia,
Right, right, right.
for brutal methods, and Putin is anything but, is shutting Russia. Whereas Peter the Great opened the window to Europe, Putin has shut the window to Europe instead. Stalin, I think Putin has a dubious attitude towards Stalin. And Putin, when I say about Putin's attitude towards this or this, they're not static. They change over time, right? So if you go back to the early 2000s, Putin would say pretty bad things about Stalin. So, Stalin, rightly, of course, was responsible for repressions, et cetera, et cetera. But now and lately, he's kind of pedaled away. He's gone back away from this. He's not criticizing Stalin for those reasons. With regard to Lenin, he definitely has a negative attitude towards Lenin. He's criticized Lenin very, very strongly in relation, for example, to Lenin's policy towards Ukraine and what Lenin did in Ukraine. So Putin has been very much against this. And the irony, of course, where the Russians are, taking over certain villages in Ukraine, they like to restore Lenin statues and things like that. So it's all kind of strange.
But is
But
he driven by the urge to re-legitimate, right? Or does he feel that maybe Russia is already on that stage? Is his psychology, I would say, driven by still trying to get approval by the West? Because it seems like that door might have closed, right?
Well, it's a different kind of approval. You can be recognized as a partner of the West. Brezhnev wanted to do that. He really liked to be recognized by Nixon as a peer, and wanted to rule the world together with Nixon. That's where the title comes from. It's a Brezhnev quote, or something that Brezhnev allegedly told Kissinger in 1973. We want to rule the world together with the United States, or to run the world together. So you can be recognized as a partner, but you can also be legitimated by being recognized as the enemy number one. In other words, if the Americans recognize Russia as their greatest enemy, then this means that Russia is great. It makes sense,
Yeah,
right?
it almost feels like they're in this arms race to be the villain against China, almost in a way, the way that our media is presenting it to American citizens.
Oh, and but he can sell it to the public, right? So he
Yeah.
tells the public that the war in Ukraine is not about his imperialist ambitions to control Ukraine, but it's a war for Russia's existence against NATO. It's a war against NATO, it's a war against the West. The entire West is fighting against Russia, which is obviously not true, but that's how he's presenting this to the domestic public, and he legitimates himself through that external recognition of Russia as number one enemy. So it's all about legitimacy. It's all about being recognized for one's greatness, even as an enemy, not necessarily as a partner. I think the same worked also for the Soviet leaders at different stages. Here's something else that I think Putin also shares with his predecessors. Like Stalin, I think Putin really believes in force. He feels that unless you speak from a position of strength, people will not take you seriously, and you cannot really achieve anything by negotiation that you cannot take by force. Now, Stalin, I think, Stalin certainly believed in brute force, but also, as I argue in the book, sometimes he was willing to back off from some of his most some of the claims that he was laying to parts of Europe or Asia in return for American recognition for other things that he already had. I wonder if Putin is like this. I wonder if Putin is also willing to moderate his appetites in return for recognition of the legitimacy of certain other gains. I don't want to speculate here. What I do want to say is that Putin is certainly just as cynical as Stalin, and just as ambitious.
unfortunately, I do want to tread into the waters of speculation a little bit, and I understand that we are just speculating and kind of gambling on what he's thinking. But is Putin trying to restore the Iron Curtain? Is he trying to restore the original Soviet, sphere of influence, or is it a more nuanced and perhaps modern outlook on the world? What do you think his motivations are today?
I think it's a combination of the old and the new. Clearly, Putin believes in spheres of influence, and that's something that Soviet leaders believed before Putin. You go back to Brezhnev, and then the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Is that all that different from Putin's invasion of Ukraine? I don't think that it's all that different. Where the difference is, in 1968, the West was willing to basically let the Soviets have it. Czechoslovakia was invaded. Oh, okay, well, it's already in their sphere of influence. Whereas here, Putin kind of counted on Ukraine being already recognized as being in Russian sphere of influence, and he was badly mistaken. I mean, the big mistake was, of course, it was in underestimating the Ukrainian resistance against Russian aggression. Because if he had, let's say, managed to capture Kiev and to oust the government and to control Ukraine, as was actually quite possible, we know actually came pretty close to him being successful in this, would then the West eventually swallow that, just as they swallowed Russian annexation of Crimea? I think the answer to this is probably yes. They would just say, well, okay, so we lost it. Okay, here are some sanctions, bad boys. But in the end, what happened was the Ukrainians resisted in the way that, for example, the Czechoslovaks could not resist in 1968, and so you have this challenge to what Putin saw as his sphere of influence in the way that Brezhnev's sphere of influence was not challenged. Stalin also thought in terms of spheres of influence, and here. And he thought that his thinking about spheres of influence was very much a 19th century concept. And you can actually draw a line from the 19th century to Stalin, to Brezhnev, to Putin. They all think in those terms. They think that Russia is a great power, therefore it is due a sphere of influence along its borders. Now, some people might say, well, what gives it the right to have a sphere of influence? And they'll say, it's just the power. We have the power. So you don't have to recognize it, but we'll assert our power. And this is what Putin is trying to do now. So that's the continuity.
So let's roll the clock back a little bit, because I think let's talk about, was it the US's fault or the USSR's fault for starting the Cold War? And obviously it's a very complicated, nuanced answer, but I think we have to, at least just talk a little bit about, since we're on the spheres of influence, the Yalta Agreement, the Percentages Agreement, and then initially the Marshall Plan was kind of that first instance of brinksmanship, right? That's where it really started to see the divide between the East and the West, if you will. And then we even saw some of Stalin's ambitions that might run counter to that narrative, that if we had just cooperated him, right, his involvement in Greece, Africa, and his interests in territories in Japan, right, it kind of breaks down some of that notion that the U.S. was the person who one-ups them and started this whole thing.
Well, it's obviously, as you say, it's very complicated, but let's take it one by one here and untangle this whole story. First, the percentages agreement, very well known. The Americans were not part of it, right? Winston Churchill comes to Moscow, gives a piece of paper to Stalin, say, okay, let's divvy up Southeastern Europe. Churchill was an imperialist just like Stalin. Here we have two imperialists thinking in very 19th century terms. So from Stalin's perspective, yeah, that made sense. Of course, you divvy up influence, so you have a little table. You're right, which percentage goes where. Hence the percentages agreement. I mean, Churchill knew that the Americans would not like this idea, but
Didn't Churchill even suggest we have to burn this when they're finished?
Yeah, we have to burn it. Stalin says, no, you keep it, you keep it. But they both thought like imperialists from the 19th century. What struck me about the percentages agreement is just how seriously Stalin took it, because in the aftermath of this conversation between Stalin and Churchill, Eden and Molotov went into the details of the percentages, and Molotov was trying to get more percentages for I think Hungary or some place like that, and in the end it got to like plus or minus 5%. And you think, how does it make any sense? It's ridiculous to be arguing about those things. Like, how do you translate these percentages into actual influence? But it's clear that Stalin actually wanted to, he was willing to abide by this, And it seemed actually for a time that he did abide by it, in particular in relation to Greece, right, where a communist revolution breaks out or a civil war breaks out. And Stalin, for a couple of years, he's actually not giving all that much support to the Greek communists, which is interesting because it does support this notion that he had limited ambitions, that he or at least that some of his ambitions he was willing to curtail in order to have this broader, great power cooperation between the Soviet Union and the West. However, he changes his position, and it's already clear. And by the way, he changes it before the Marshall Plan even announced, sort of around the time of spring 1947, of course. He starts supporting the Greek communists more directly. And this is all done in great secret. Now we have the documents from that period where Stalin, there are actual documents where he goes through like a list of weapons that he's going to provide to the Greek communists and say, okay, we'll give them this, we cannot give them this, we will give them this. So he gets much more hands-on and much more involved, which shows that Stalin was not a static actor. He was dynamic. He could change his views, and he could lay claims to things that he for a time was not willing to touch, which again brings us to this question of the origins of the Cold War. I mean, few points to make. First of all, the slide into the Cold War was not a sudden thing. It took several years, right? It's a process. It's a slippery slope. You start going that way. Some people might say it was inevitable. It didn't seem inevitable at the time. But eventually it just happened, right? But it took a few years. So that's one. It's one point. Second point, yes, it takes two to tango, and yes, there are actions and there are reactions on both sides. So Stalin reacts in a kind of a brutal manner to something that the Americans do. The Americans react in a very defensive manner, sometimes also quite a brutal manner against something that Stalin does. And so you have this back and forth. It doesn't mean that both sides are equally responsible for the outbreak of the Cold War. Right. And finally, there's this. There's the French saying that the appetite comes during eating. And, if you're Stalin, you're cynical. You're a deeply cynical person. We know that Stalin was deeply cynical. We know he believed in brute force. We also know he wanted to avoid another world war. Those are important considerations. But if you are allowed to have this extra strip of territory, if you impose yourself there, then you kind of think, well, what about this other thing? What about if I take another step? And that's what, in the end, that's where containment becomes important. And George Kennan recognized that. And George Kennan argued in Lone Telegram, impervious to the logic of reasons, the Soviets are highly sensitive to the logic of force. That's why when faced with reaction, they'll usually retract and try something else. If we did not have, we the West, if we did not have the containment policy in place, can we say with absolute guarantee that Stalin would have been content, that he would have been satisfied with what he got in Eastern Europe and would have not extended, tried to undermine the West, would not have extended his influence elsewhere? There is no way to argue this, right? So the only safe policy from the standpoint of the West was to adopt a policy of containment. Now, you might argue, though, that tragically it also is what contributed to the Cold War, because containment, what does that mean? That means pushing back. And when you push back, the other side might think, oh God, they're pushing back against us. We also have to push back against them, because otherwise they'll think that they are, that we're weak or whatever, and then they can impose our will. So this is the well-known security dilemma, in which IR theorists know all about, but it's not exactly, it's kind of broader than security dilemma by itself. It just has, there's this psychological element of back and forth, which brings us into the Cold War. All that is a long introduction to saying that I do think that Stalin was mainly responsible for the Cold War. Simply, he was, just such a dark, cynical individual who just wanted power. Now, you could also argue, though, and I think I would also subscribe to this, that his vision of the world was simply in contradiction with the American vision of the world. It was more in alignment with people like Churchill, who thought in terms of sphere of influence. And it was certainly out of tune with the American post-war vision of the world, which was more open. America recognized only one sphere of influence, which was America, the whole world. Um,
Yeah, right.
so, right. So, that was incompatible with this kind of imperialist thinking that Stalin had that just goes back to the 19th century. So it's a clash of vision. It's also Stalin's dark personality. Individuals probably mattered, although I don't know. I don't want to push that too far. Obviously FDR's death in April 1945 made things worse. He didn't trust Truman. I mean, Stalin did not trust Truman, didn't know what kind of person he was. And then another factor, and that's important, and that's the atomic weapons, the atomic bomb, the emergence of that obviously from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviets felt they could not give any concessions to the Americans, and Stalin made it very clear. We have this remarkable correspondence. One of the things that I had access to was Stalin's correspondence with Molotov, when Molotov was in London for the London Conference of Foreign Ministers in the beginning in September 1945. Stalin sent him daily messages, almost daily messages, in which he really explained Soviet foreign policy, his goals, etc. And there we can see just how concerned he was about the American atomic monopoly, the fact that the Americans were kind of pushing on the USSR. I mean, he doesn't quite say atomic bomb there in the correspondence, but he says, the Allies are pressing on you to break your will. Therefore, you must show complete defiance and push back. And so that's the advice that Stalin was giving, and obviously that's connected to the atomic bomb, in my view, which is why I think that it was a crucial component at the beginning of the Cold War.
I have you brought up the containment strategy, and I almost feel that in modern day we have this contemporary containment strategy of just kind of funding the other side and not working with Putin or figuring out a diplomatic means to the end. And I do think that the Trump administration, that's what they're saying is, oh, we're going to end this as president-elect, and imagine that he will give some concession to Russia to give them that feeling of legitimization, and then maybe they'll, move on. But I guess what my question was going to be is the way that Putin is this master manipulator and propagandist, and obviously he's learned this from his predecessors as well. I guess I'm curious if there is a path towards diplomacy here, or if there is a path towards kind of wrapping this up through different sanctions or methods or concessions. I don't know if we're getting. Here's what I would say on what I hear all the time. If we concede parts of Ukraine to Putin today, they are going to continue into the Balkans, into Poland, into Hungary. And I'm curious, like we're saying, is obviously Stalin had these intentions under his belt. I'm curious if we feel that, is there a legitimate claim to some of this land in Ukraine? If we give the concessions, is there this risk that things will continue? Is there this risk that they're playing the villain and they're going to continue to do such?
So there's always a risk, right? But the question is quantifying this risk, how great this risk is, and here you have to think more about the capabilities than the intentions. It may be, I mean, intentions do change. People may think that they can do certain things on one day, the next day they'll think, okay, we can no longer do that, and we'll have to just be satisfied with what we have, and that is just as true of Stalin or Brezhnev as it is true of Putin, I think. So when I hear prognostications by politicians today that if some kind of a settlement is reached over Ukraine, that the next thing Putin will invade the Baltics or invade who else, Norway or something like that. I think there's a lot of guesswork that's going into this, but there's an important point to be made here, and that is the more he feels that there's a sense of unity among allies, the more he feels that there's the more he's deterred, the less he's likely. I think here Kennan's arguments about Soviet foreign policy just really strike the target. Putin is a opportunist. He's looking for opportunities. He's looking for ways of exploiting Western weakness. One consistent element of Russian and Soviet foreign policy historically since the 1940s has been to weaken NATO and to break up united Europe and united West. Fortunately for the West, unfortunately for them, their own stupid actions always have triggered the opposite results. So just when NATO has been looking for purpose, the Russians did something so stupid that it brought NATO back together in a way that clearly is very anti-Russian at this stage. So Putin clearly made a strategic mistake there. Anyway, so all of this is simply to say that I think deterrence still works. I think deterrence is very important, but it is also important, I think, to understand that Putin is not a just mindless robot, and that he can change his views about certain things. He can change his ambitions, his goals, and he has shown that in Ukraine as well. He's shown that throughout this conflict how he has adopted his goals. He's changed his goals from one thing, from one day to the next. Is that something crazy? No, I mean, we do that all the time. That's the whole point, right? People change, and people are able to change their means, sometimes change their ends as well. What else is there to say about Putin in
Well,
Ukraine?
I'm reminded as you're talking of a statement when Truman said it to Stalin, and it created this kind of whoa moment to Stalin, I believe. And he said, why don't we fund both sides of their conflict, essentially, and let them kill themselves, right? And I almost feel that that's the United States government. I've even heard politicians state that outright is let's go fund the other side and let them continue to kind of fight this out without us. And I almost think that this is that was in chapter 1 of your book, right? It was this kind of fighting or this friction that was created between the United States and
Yeah,
Russia, and it seems like that might be what's happening right now. State
yeah,
admission.
that's right. I mean, that goes back to Stalin's views of basically the capitalists being all sort of having conflicts among themselves. And so, as Stalin puts at one point, we'll see who's winning, we'll support the other side, and just kind of play them against one against the other to see who wins out. And that's what we have to do as cynical opportunists. Basically, he doesn't quite say that, but I think Putin. Okay, if you put yourself in Putin's shoes today, you're looking at the West and you're trying to figure out, okay, what should I do? First of all, there's an upheaval in the United States, a political upheaval, a campaign. And that is quite open-ended. It's very difficult to say what's going to happen, which side is going to win. If you're Putin, you want to wait for the outcome of this and see and plan your actions accordingly. So obviously, from Putin's perspective, a very strong support on the part of the United States for Ukraine, long-term support would be something that would not be in his interest. He's hoping that this support will diminish. Will the support diminish with Trump? May well be the case. Will this support diminish with Kamala Harris administration? May well be the case. It's it has been diminishing over time. So if you're Putin, you're kind of calculating the decline. You're counting on the decline of U.S. support for Ukraine, which makes it then easier to basically tell the Ukrainians, look, you have no choice. You have no choice. You have to just basically give up. Also, if you are Putin, you've put all this treasure, you've poured all that blood into this conflict, and now you're thinking, okay, what am I going to get back for this? You might think, if I can have all of Ukraine, I might as well. If I can have it and not, anyway, the price has already been paid to a certain extent. So I think when we look at Ukraine, and again, this takes us far away from the subject of this book, but if you look at Ukraine, you have to put yourself in the shoes of those leaders. You have to put yourself in Putin's shoes, and you have to try to ask yourself, what would I do if I were Putin at this stage? How would I want to end this war now, or would I want to continue? And then you have to, consider a number of issues. How much is my domestic pressure? What am I facing? Is there domestic backlash against this? Is there an economic crisis? Is there this? Is there that? Or can I just continue fighting this war? For the time being, I think Putin can afford to continue fighting this war. And that's why he's playing for time. He's trying to see how the United States will play itself out in the coming months. And then on that basis, he may be willing to strike a bargain. And I put a focus here, just put a lot of focus on or emphasis on the term maybe, because again, he is somebody who can adopt his means and also change his aims. So both means and aims are negotiable, but you want to get as much as you can. And you're certainly no friend of America. You're certainly no friend of the West. You want basically the West to become ever more disunited and things to fall apart, because as things fall apart, you can gain from this, because Putin feels that the post-Cold War settlement, as he sees it, was unfair to Russia, and that Russia deserves a better place in the international system. It deserves a higher standing in the international hierarchy than the one that it got. And that explains so much about his actions. That's why there's a continuity between the Cold War and the post-Cold War, because in 1991, the Soviets fell apart, the Russians, the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russians were hoping for something else that ultimately they did not get. And so they felt, a lot of, not just the elites, but also the people felt like somehow Russia was left out and did not get what it deserved. And so now there's this resentment that Putin is building on. He's trying to recover some kind of sense of greatness, just as the Soviets before him during the Cold War.
Mike, I want to pass it back to you if you have any last thoughts here before we wrap it up. I mean, this has been awesome and enlightening, and it just solidifies how important it is to keep the ideology in mind and keep history in mind, but really analyzing the psychology of these actors is really going to be how we find a way to come out of it. And that's personally what I think is what needs to happen. We need to end this war.
My question to you would be, Professor, is just what did we miss that you really want to hammer home from the book? We could go on probably another hour just talking about even towards the end of the Cold War, the Gorbachev period, the feeling of Reagan and H.W. Bush having, being in a strong position, really putting their foot on the face of the opponent when they're down on the ground. But I like I said, is there anything that we really missed during the course of the interview that you want to hammer home to our listeners?
So there are a couple of points which I think are important. First is that the history of the Cold War, any history of the Cold War, is full of turning points and roads not taken. And so it looks in retrospect like everything was inevitable, but actually nothing was inevitable. And that's what I felt while working on this book. I felt that often history would take a particular turn that was quite unexpected, could not be foreseen, but ultimately had a huge impact on how things unfolded later. That's one issue, right? For example, the way that the Cuban Missile Crisis played out and how Khrushchev pulled back from the brink. Did he have to? Was it inevitable? It wasn't inevitable. We could have all died in October.
Right.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's really interesting because, of course, later Kennedy would get all this congratulations. You were so tough on the Soviets. We won the Cuban Missile Crisis. We could have actually, we could have all been dead, and there would be nobody around to congratulate anyone else. So we just got very, very lucky in 1962 and a bunch of other times. So it's important, I think, to remember that things are never inevitable until things actually happen. The second point that I want viewers and listeners to take away from the book is just the enormous complexity of history. And that is super important because if you look at all this, you look at all these people, they were very complex individuals. They were motivated by a variety of things. And it's sometimes very difficult to track down specific motivations. There's always a combination of various factors, motivations that brought them to a certain point. And also the same could be said about lessons. There are no clear lessons history doesn't give any clear lessons, which is kind of sad, a sad thing for historian to say, because we're constantly called upon to bring judgments of history and apply them to the present day. And I can say, we don't, there's lots of things that Cold War can teach us, but I don't know if they're all so there's no, they're not definitive. So
Right, right.
there are a variety of things, which makes me very skeptical about lessons of history when people talk about, oh, Munich, here's the lesson and here's how. That's nothing, right? That's those history lessons, they don't mean anything. So I think it's important, but I think history is still important because as you read history, you understand the complexity of this. So, for example, my reading of the Cold War, I apply that to my analysis of Russia's regime today, and I can see a regime that is motivated by a variety of factors, which makes me automatically suspicious when people say, here's what Putin thinks, and here's the reason that he's acting in a particular way without providing any evidence. My response to this is, look, things are never simple. Just look at history. Everything is so complicated. So that just I think those two parting thoughts.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate it. And Mike, thanks for coming on today with us as always. And Professor Radchenko, thank you so much. This was completely invaluable, and we're really grateful for your time. So without any more, thank you very much. This has been Elevated Thoughts.
Thanks, guys.